Section 32 of the Endeavour Journal of Sir Joseph Banks. Journal from 25 August 1768 to 12 July 1771 by Joseph Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Section 32. Account of New Zealand, Part 1. As we intend to leave this place tomorrow morn, I shall spend a few sheets in drawing together what I have observed of this country and its inhabitants, premising in the meantime that in this and all others of the same kind which may occur in this journal, I shall give myself liberty of conjecturing and drawing conclusions from which I have observed, in which I may doubtless often be mistaken. In the daily journal, however, the observations may be seen, and anyone who refers to that may draw his own conclusions from them, attending as little as he pleases to any of mine. This country was first discovered by Abel Janssen Tasman on the 13th of December 1642, and called by him New Zealand. He, however, never went ashore upon it, probably for fear of the natives, who, when he had come to an anchor, set upon one of his boats and killed 3 or 4 out of 7 people that were in her. Tasman certainly was an able navigator. He sailed into the mouth of the Cook's Strait, and finding himself surrounded, in all appearance, with land, observed the tide of flood to come from the southeast. From thence he conjectured that there was in that place a passage through the land, which conjecture we proved to be true, and he himself had certainly done, had not the wind changed, as he thought, in his favour, giving him an opportunity of returning the way he came in, which he preferred to standing into a bay with an on-shore wind. Upon the strength of conjecture only, again, when he came the length of Cape Maria van Diemen, he observed hollow waves to come from the northeast, from whence he concluded it to be the northernmost part of the land, which we really found it to be. Lastly, to his eternal credit be it spoken, though he had been 4 months absent from Batavia when he made this land, and had sailed both eastward and westward, his longitude, allowing for an error of in that of Batavia, as he himself has stated it, differs no more than from ours, which is corrected by an innumerable number of observations of the moon and sun, etc., as well as a transit of Mercury over the sun, all calculated and observed by Mr. Green, a mathematician of well-known abilities, who was sent out in this ship by the Royal Society to observe the transit of Venus. Thus much for Tasman. It were much to be wished, however, that we had a fuller account of his voyage than that published by Dirk Rembrandts, which seems to be no more than a short extract, and that other navigators would imitate him in mentioning the latitudes and longitudes in which they account the places from whence they take their departure to be situated, which precaution, useful as it is, may almost be said to have been used by Tasman alone. The face of the country is in general mountainous, especially inland, where probably runs a chain of very high hills, parts of which we saw at several times. They were generally covered with snow, and certainly very high. Some of our officers, men of experience, did not scruple to say as much so as the Pike of Teneriffe. In that particular, however, I cannot quite agree with them, though that they must be very high is sufficiently proved by the hill to the northward of the mouth of Cook's Straits, which was seen, and made no inconsiderable figure, at the distance of leagues. The sea-coast, should it ever be examined, will probably be found to abound in good harbours. We saw several, of which the Bay of Islands or Motuaro, and Queen Charlotte Sound or Totra Nui, are as good as any seaman need desire to come into, either for good anchorage or convenience of wooding and watering. The outer ridge of land which lies open to the sea is, as I believe is the case in most countries, generally barren, especially to the southward, but within that the hills are covered with thick woods quite to the top, and every valley produces a rivulet of water. The soil is in general light, and consequently admirably adapted to the uses for which the natives cultivate it, whose crops consist entirely of roots. On the southern and western sides it is the most barren, the sea being there generally bounded with either steep hills or vast tracts of sand, which probably is the reason why the people in these parts were so much less numerous, and lived almost entirely upon fish. The northern and eastern sides make, however, some amends for the barrenness of the others. In them we often saw very large tracts of ground, which either actually were, or very lately had been, cultivated, and an immense quantity of woodland, which was yet uncleared. but promised great returns to the people who would take the trouble of clearing it. Of the latter, especially in Taonaroa, or Poverty Bay, and Tolaga, besides swamps, which might doubtless easily be drained, and sufficiently evinced the richness of their soil by the great size of all the plants that grew upon them, and more particularly of the timber trees, which were the straightest, cleanest, and I may say the largest I have ever seen, at least speaking of them in the gross. I may have seen several times single trees larger than any I observed among them, but it was not one but all these trees which were enormous, and doubtless, had we had time and opportunity to search, we might have found many larger ones than any we saw, as we were never but once ashore among them, and that but for a short time on the banks of the river Thames, where we rode for many miles between woods of these trees, to which we could see no bounds. The river Thames is indeed, in every respect, the properest place we have yet seen for establishing a colony. A ship as large as ours might be carried several miles up the river, where she would be moored to the trees, as safe as alongside a wharf in London river, a safe and sure retreat in case of an attack from the natives, as she might even be laid on the mud, and a bridge built to her. The noble timber, of which there is such abundance, would furnish plenty of materials, either for building defences, houses, or vessels. The river would furnish plenty of fish, and the soil make ample returns of any European vegetables sown in it. I have some reason to think from observations made upon the vegetables that the winters here are extremely mild, much more so than in England. The summers we have found to be scarce at all hotter, though more equably warm. The south part, which is much more hilly and barren than the north, I firmly believe to abound with minerals in a very high degree. This, however, is only conjecture. I had not, to my great regret, an opportunity of landing in any place where the signs of them were promising, except the last, nor indeed in any one where from the ship the country appeared likely to produce them, which it did to the southward in a very high degree, as I have mentioned in my daily journal. In all the times that we have landed in this country, we have seen, I had almost said, no quadrupeds, really original natives of it. Dogs and rats indeed there were, the former, as in other countries, companions of the men, and the latter probably brought hither by the men, especially as they are so scarce that I myself have not had the opportunity of seeing even one. Of seals, indeed, we have seen a few, and one sea lion, but these were in the sea, and are certainly very scarce, as we have seen no signs of them among the natives, except a few teeth of the latter, which they make into a kind of bodkins, and value much. It appears not improbable that there really are no other species of quadrupeds in the country, for the natives, whose chief luxury of dress consists in skins and hair of dogs, and the skins of diverse birds, and who wear for ornaments the bones and beaks of birds and teeth of dogs, would probably have made use of some part of any other animal they were acquainted with, a circumstance which, though we carefully sought after, we never saw the least signs of. Of birds there are not many species, and none except perhaps the gannet, the same as those of Europe. However, there are ducks and shags of several kinds, sufficiently like the European ones to be called the same by the seamen, both which we eat and accounted good food, especially the former, which are not at all inferior to those of Europe. Besides these there are hawks, owls, and quails, differing but little at first sight from those of Europe, and several small birds that sing much more melodiously than any I have ever heard. The sea coast is also frequently visited by many oceanic birds, such as albatrosses, shearwaters, pintados, etc., and has also a few birds called by Sr. J.N.O. Narborough penguins, which are truly what the French call nuances between fishes and birds, as their feathers, especially on their wings, differ but little from scales, and their wings themselves, which they use only in diving, and by no means in attempting to fly or even accelerate their motion on the surface of the water, as young birds are observed to do, might thence almost properly be called fins. Neither are insects in greater plenty than birds. A few butterflies and beetles, flesh flies, like those in Europe, mosquitoes, and sandflies, may be exactly the same as those of North America, make up the whole list. Of these last, however, which are most justly accounted the curse of any country where they abound, we never met with any great abundance. A few indeed there were in almost every place we went into, but never enough to make any occupations ashore troublesome, or to give occasion for using shades for the face, which we had brought out to defend ourselves from them. For this scarcity of animals on the land, the sea, however, makes abundant recompense. Every creek and corner produces abundance of fish, not only wholesome, but at least as well tasted as our fish in Europe. The ships seldom anchored in, or indeed passed over in light winds, any place whose bottom was such as fish resort to in general, but as many were caught with hook and line as the people could eat, especially to the southward, where when we lay at an anchor, the boats by fishing with hook and line very near the rocks could take any quantity of fish. Besides that, the seine seldom failed of success, insomuch that both the times that we anchored to the southward of Cook's Straits, every mess in the ship that had prudence enough salted as much fish as lasted them many weeks after they went to sea. For the sorts, there are mackerel of several kinds, one precisely the same as our English ones, and another much like our horse mackerel, besides several more. These come in immense shoals and are taken by the natives in large seines, from whom we bought them at very easy rates. Besides these were many species, which, though they did not at all resemble any fish that I at least have seen before, our seamen contrived to give names to, so that hakes, breams, coalfish, etc., were appellations familiar with us, and I must say that those who bear these names in England need not be ashamed of their namesakes in this country. But above all the luxuries we met with, the lobsters, or sea crawfish, must not be forgot, which are possibly the same that in Lord Anson's voyage are mentioned to be found at the island of Juan Fernandez. They are large, though not quite so large as those of Juan Fernandez, and differ from ours in England in having many more prickles on their backs, and being red when taken out of the water. Of them we bought great quantities of the natives everywhere to the northward, who catch them by diving near the shore, feeling first with their feet till they find out where they lie. We had also that fish described by Frazier in his voyage to Spanish South America by the name of elephant, pejegalo, or poisson coq, which though coarse we made shift to eat, several species of skates or stingrays, which were abominably coarse, but to make amends for that we had among several sorts of dogfish one that was spotted with a few white spots, whose flavour was similar to, but much more delicate than our skate. We had flatfish also like soles and flounders, eels and congers of several sorts, and many others which any Europeans who may come here after us will not fail to find the advantage of, besides excellent oysters, and many sorts of shellfish and cockles, clams, etc. Though the country is generally covered with an abundant verdure of grass and trees, yet I cannot say that it is productive of so great a variety as many countries I have seen. The entire novelty, however, of the greatest part of what we found recompensed us, as natural historians, for the want of variety. Sow thistle, garden nightshade, and perhaps 1 or 2 kinds of grasses were exactly the same as in England, 3 or 4 kinds of fern, the same as those of the West Indies, and a plant or 2 that are common to almost all the world. These were all that had before been described by any botanist, out of about 400 species, except 5 or 6 which we ourselves had before seen in Tierra del Fuego. Eatable vegetables there are very few. We indeed, as people who had been long at sea, found great benefit in the article of health by eating plentifully of wild celery and a kind of cresses which grew everywhere abundantly near the seaside. We also once or twice met with an herb, like that which the country people in England call lamb's quarter or fat hen, which we boiled instead of greens, and once only a cabbage tree, the cabbage of which made us one delicious meal. These, with the fern roots and one other vegetable, Pandanus blanc, totally unknown in Europe, which though eat by the natives no European will probably ever relish, are the whole of the vegetables which I know to be eatable, except those which they cultivate, and have probably brought with them from the country from whence they themselves have originally come. Nor does their cultivated grounds produce many species of esculent plants. 3 only have I seen: yams, sweet potatoes, and cocoas, all 3 well known in both East and West Indies, and much esteemed of these, especially the 2 former. They cultivate often pieces of many acres, and I believe any ship that was to be to the northward in the autumn, about the time of digging them up, might purchase any quantity. Besides these they cultivate gourds, the fruits of which serve them to make bottles, jugs, etc., and a very small quantity of the Chinese paper mulberry tree, the same as the inhabitants of the South Sea Islands use, to make their garments of. This they very much value, but it is so scarce with them, probably having been brought from a hotter country, and not thriving here, that though they likewise beat it out into cloth, We never saw pieces of it larger than what served to put into the holes they bore in their ears, making an ornament they are very fond of, and this was doubtless the reason why they preferred the cloth which we had brought from the South Sea Islands with us to any merchandise we could show them, and next to it white paper. Fruits they have none, except, I should reckon, a few kind of insipid berries, which had neither sweetness nor flavour to recommend them, and which none but the boys took the pains to gather. The woods, however, abound with excellent timber trees, fit for any kind of building in size, grain, and apparent durability. One which bears a very conspicuous scarlet flower made up of many threads, and is a large tree, as big as an oak in England, has a very hard wood, which seems well adapted for the cogs of mill wheels, etc., or any purpose for which very hard wood is used. That which I have before mentioned to grow in the swamps, which has a leaf not unlike yew, and bears small bunches of berries, is tall, straight, and thick enough to make masts for vessels of any size, and seems likewise by the straight direction of the fibres to be tough, but it is too heavy. This, however, I have been told is the case with the pitch pine in North America, the timber of which this very much resembles, and that the North Americans know how to lighten by tapping it properly, and actually use for masts. But of all the plants we have seen among these people, that which is the most excellent in its kind, and which really excels most, if not all that are put to the same uses in other countries, is the plant which serves them instead of hemp and flax. Of this there are two sorts. The leaves of both much resemble those of flags. The flowers are smaller and grow much more together. In one sort they are yellowish, in the other of a deep red. Of the leaves of these plants, with very little preparation, all their common wearing apparel are made, and all strings, lines, and cordage for every purpose, and that of a strength so much superior to hemp as scarce to bear a comparison with it. From the same leaves also by another preparation, a kind of snow-white fibres are drawn, shining almost as silk, and likewise surprisingly strong, of which all their finer clothes are made. And of the leaves, without any preparation than splitting them into proper breadths, and tying those strips together, are made their fishing nets. So useful a plant would doubtless be a great acquisition to England, especially as one might hope that it would thrive there with very little trouble, as it seems hardy and affects no particular soil, being found equally on hills and in valleys, in dry soil and the deepest bogs, which last land it seems, however, rather to prefer, as I have always seen it in such places of a larger size than anywhere else. When we first came ashore we imagined the country to be much better peopled than afterwards we found it, concluding from the smokes that we saw that there were inhabitants very far inland, which indeed, in Poverty Bay and the Bay of Plenty, which are much the best peopled parts of the country that we have seen, may yet be the case. In all the other parts we have been in, we have, however, found the sea-coast only inhabited, and that but sparingly, insomuch that the number of inhabitants seem to bear no kind of proportion to the size of the country which they possess, and this probably is owing to their frequent wars. Besides this, the whole coast from Cape Maria van Diemen to Mount Egmont, and 7/8 of the South Island, seem totally without people. The men are of the size of the larger Europeans, stout, plain-limbed, and active, fleshy but never fat, as the lazy inhabitants of the South Sea Islands are, vigorous, nimble, and at the same time clever in all their exercises. I have seen 15 paddles of a side in one of their canoes move with immense quick strokes, and at the same time as much justness, as if the movers were animated by one soul. Not the fraction of a second could be observed between the dipping and raising any two of them, the canoe all the while moving with incredible swiftness, and to see them dance their war dance was an amusement which never failed to please every spectator. So much strength, firmness, and agility in their motions, and at the same time such excellent time kept, that I have often heard above 100 paddles, etc., struck against the sides of their boats, as directed by their singing, without a mistake being ever made. In colour they vary a little, some being browner than others, but few are browner than a Spaniard, a little sunburnt, might be supposed to be. The women, without being at all delicate in their outward appearance, are rather smaller than European women, but have a peculiar softness of voice, which never fails to distinguish them from the men, though both are dressed exactly alike. They are like those of the fair sex that I have seen in other countries, more lively, airy, and laughter-loving than the men, and have more volatile spirits, formed by nature to soften the cares of more serious man, who takes upon him the laborious toil of war and tilling the ground, etc. That disposition appears even in this uncultivated state of nature, showing in a high degree that, as well as in uncivilized as the most polished nations, man's ultimate happiness must at last be placed in woman. The dispositions of both sexes seem mild, gentle, and very affectionate to each other, but implacable towards their enemies, who after having killed they eat, probably out of a principle of revenge, and I believe never give quarter or take prisoners. They seem inured to war, and in their attacks work themselves up by their war dance to a kind of artificial courage which will not let them think in the least. Whenever they met with us and thought themselves superior, they always attacked us, though seldom seeming to mean more than to provoke us to show them what we were able to do in this case. By many trials we found that good usage and fair words would not avail the least with them, nor would they be convinced by the noise of our firearms alone that they were superior to theirs. But as soon as they had felt the smart of even a load of small shot, and had had time allowed to recollect themselves from the effects of their artificial courage, which commonly took a day, they were sensible of our generosity in not taking advantage of our superiority, and became at once our good friends, and upon all occasions placed the most unbounded confidence in us. They are not like the islanders addicted to stealing, but would sometimes, before peace was concluded, if they could be offering anything they had to sale, entice us to trust something of ours into their hands, refuse to return it with all coolness in the world, seeming to look upon it as the plunder of an enemy. End of section 32. Account of New Zealand, Part 1.